So I defined my basic setup for a new Node Express REST API. We have our route and its controller. And now, of course, we need to return some data there. So inside of the controller, in getPosts, we want to return some data. Because you learned REST APIs are all about data. We will not call REST render in here because we will not render a view. You will not see me call REST render anymore again because REST APIs simply don't render views because they don't return HTML, and a rendered view is HTML. Instead, we'll do something we already saw in the async request module of this course. We will return a JSON response. JSON is a method provided by express.js that allows us to conveniently return a response with JSON data, with the right headers being set, and so on. We can pass a normal JavaScript object to JSON, and it will be converted to the JSON format and sent back as a response to the client who sent the request. And there we can send anything we want, like posts, which could be an array of posts, where we have a title, first post, and some content. This is the first post. And of course, I'm just making up things here. This is, of course, just some dummy data. So we call REST.json, and this will send a JSON response. Now, when sending JSON responses, we also want to send the status code explicitly. 200 would be the default, but we'll also work with different status codes throughout this module, and we want to be clear about the status code our response has, so that in the client, we have an easy way of handling it. Because you always have to remember that the client now has to render the user interface based on your response. And therefore, especially error codes are super important to pass back to the client so that the client can just have a look at the status code and find out, should I render my normal user interface because the request succeeded? Or did I get an error and I want to render an appropriate error interface? Previously in the course, we sent the whole interface, so the client didn't have to worry about that. Now the client has to, and therefore setting the right status code is important. Now with that, we have some logic in place to return some dummy data. With npm start, we can now start up our server here, and now we have it running, and now we can visit a browser, and for now, we can simply enter localhost 8080/feed/posts. So this path we defined. And you should get some JSON data here. If you open your developer tools and you go to the network tab in there and you reload that page, you also see that request here. And if you inspect it, you of course see the response body. But if you have a look at the headers, you see that in the response headers, we see that application JSON was set automatically by our server because we used that JSON method, and we indeed get back the content we defined here. We can see it here too. So this is a quick and easy way of testing this. Now, obviously, our users would never visit it like this. They could, if we don't require authentication at least. But this is, of course, not how we intend our API to be used. Instead, we'll build a user interface that will then use this behind the scenes and render a beautiful UI automatically with that data. So directly accessing the data like this is, of course, not the plan. Now, before I come back to the user interface part, though, let me show you how we can easily and conveniently test our REST API even without entering this into the browser. And for that, let me do something which you couldn't enter into the browser. Let's define a post route. So besides being able to get posts, we typically would also have some routes that allow us to add new posts. Now, if we quickly think about our different HTTP methods, then for posting new posts, post would be a great HTTP method. We could also use put. That would not necessarily be wrong. Put would also be a valid method to be used for creating a resource. But especially when we're talking about posts and not something like user data, which only exists once, but posts, there might be multiple posts. And therefore, adding or appending sounds good to me. And hence I want to use the post method instead of put. If we were to manage the user data here, then maybe put might be better, because there we indeed create or overwrite the resource. So post it is, and hence I will name this post, which sounds a bit strange. It's just my naming convention. I have the HTTP method first, and then basically the object that gets created. You could name this totally different. You could name this create post if you want to. Let's maybe name it like this because it's clearer. Then I have my normal function that of course does not change. And here we would of course reach out to the database. We'll do so soon. For now, I'll just note that we have to create that in the database, and I will just return the response, assuming that we did create the post. So I'll send back a JSON response, and there we might be having a message like post created successfully, and we send back some post data. And now that is at least data I want to parse from the incoming request. So I expect to get a title, let's say, and I still parse that on the request body. So essentially what we always did throughout this course. And I might be extracting a content too, also from request body, just what we did throughout the course. And here I return the created post with an ID that was generated automatically, let's say, as MongoDB does it for us. Here I'm just doing it with some dummy code, and the title which I received and the content. And this could just be the confirmation that it was stored in the database successfully, which of course it wasn't thus far, but which we'll add. Now, first of all, I also want to set a special status code here with the status method. I want to set it to 201. The default would be 200, and this would not be horribly wrong, but 201 is the better status code to use if you want to tell the client, success, a resource was created. Just 200 is just success. 201 also indicates that we created a resource, and of course we did here, at least in theory. So manually setting this makes a lot of sense. With that, we're sending this success code. Now, what is missing? Well, a way of parsing that data. I did install body parser in an earlier lecture, but we also need to set it up. And now here's one important thing. You need to remember that we are working with incoming JSON data. We expect our clients to communicate with our API with requests that contain JSON data, just as we return JSON data. JSON data is the data format we want to use both for requests and for responses. And therefore, I will use my body parser, of course. That's why I installed it. So let's require it here in our app.js file. But when I initialize it differently than what we used it for in the majority of the course. Because there I initialized it by calling URL encoded and configuring that. Now, this is great for data formats or for requests that hold data in the format of XWWW form URL encoded. You might remember we saw that in earlier lectures too. Now, this is the default data that data has if submitted through a form post request. We don't need that here, however. We don't need form data. We have no form data. Instead, we want to use body parser with the JSON method, which is able to parse JSON data from incoming requests. So this is good for application JSON, as is the official name that you will find in the header. And this is how the data will be appended to the request that reaches our server. So we need this middleware to parse incoming JSON data so that we are able to extract it on the body, because that will be added by our body parser, this body field on the incoming request. With that, we can extract all that data, but how can we now test this? We can't create a form which we submit, because then we would be back to XWWW form URL encoded data. And it would also not be a realistic test because you just don't use forms like this when working with REST APIs. Instead, you can use a very handy special tool, and that is Postman. Now, we will build or work with a real front end very soon, no worries. So we'll not be stuck to some helping tool for the rest of this course. But it's still a very useful API development tool which you should be aware of. It's free to use, and you can simply Google for it to get it from getpostman.com. There, you can just download Postman and walk through the installer. Again, you don't need to pay, you don't need to sign up. It might ask you for that, but you don't need to. Once you did load it, You'll end up on a starting page like this. You can just close that window. And you'll then end up in a user interface like this one. Now, you can read the official Postman docs to learn about all the things you can do, but in the end, what you can do is you can enter a URL here, then choose your different HTTP methods, and you see more than I showed you, but you won't need most of them. They're not required for typical CRUD operations. So you can choose your method here and then send a request. You can also add your own headers, and you will see the response in the area below this. So here, I can send a request to localhost 8080, which is where my node server runs on, and then feed/post. This should be the route I want to reach this controller on. Now, for that, I first of all need to create the route. So in my feed routes file, I'll add a post route /post, where I use the feed controller create post action. So this will be reached through a post request to feed/post. Let's configure such a request here, feed/post. This is exactly where I'm sending it to. And now I just need to switch to the post method. Now, with that switched, I also need to be able to send some data, and you see that the body tab now got enabled. With get, it was disabled because get requests can't hold a body, post requests can. Here you can now choose your format, and we don't need any of these. Instead, I'll choose raw, and then there in the drop-down, JSON, application JSON. So now here we can write some JSON data. And JSON has a format where you have two surrounding curly braces, and then you have key value pairs where, if you're writing it manually, the keys have to be wrapped in double quotation marks. So here we can see what we expect to get. We expect to get a title, and we expect to get a content. So we want to pass these two fields to our server. So here we can pass the title, and this can be my first post, or actually my second post, because we use the first one as a dummy post in our get route. And then here we have the content. This is the content of my first post, or of my second post, of course. So this is now my request. We can now click send, and we get back a response, which looks good because it's the response I defined in my controller action with this message and the post that was created. And this is now the data we would typically use in our receiving client. You also see the headers that were sent on the response. These were set automatically by Express, especially application JSON matters, of course. And this is now how we can test all our endpoints, because we can just enter them here and then switch the HTTP methods, pass any extra headers or bodies we might need, and therefore we got everything we need to test our API. Still, we will also work with a real frontend so that we have something beautiful to look at and to see that in a real app. But this is a tool you will use a lot when working with REST APIs.